Well, everyone, thank you for coming. I see some repeat visitors here today, some new faces too. I just wanted to let you know that I appreciate you sharing your afternoon with me, and welcome back. Today's lecture is Campus Martius, the heart of Detroit from 1912 to 2012. I'm your presenter, Lucas McGrail. For those of you who remember me, that's great, but for those of you who are new, just a little bit of background on myself. I have a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Detroit Mercy. I've recently been admitted to the master's program of Lawrence Technological University. I am a member in good standing of the American Institute of Architects, as well as a member and accredited professional of the United States Green Building Council. I am also a self-educated Detroit historian and lecturer, and I have one of the 10 largest private collections of Detroit memorabilia in southeastern Michigan. The focus of today's lecture will be the history of Campus Martius. We're going to talk about its origins, the key landmarks, both past and present. I'm going to discuss how you can learn more if you choose to do so. There will be some websites and book titles. If you'd like to take those down, feel free. And I'll have a very short question and answer period at the end. So we're going to start with our focus site, which is made up of several focus sites. So Campus Martius itself can be seen here in this map representation, but it is made up of the Sanders Block here on the northwest corner, the Kearns Block located on the northeast corner, the Real Estate Block located here to the south, to the southeast the Pontchartrain Block, to the southwest the Hammond Block, and then to the east or to the west Kennedy Square. I'll also be talking about the monuments that were once in Campus Martius and that are still in Campus Martius. So in order to properly talk about Campus Martius, we have to go back to the beginning with the birth of a city. In 1701, the French officially founded a trading post and settlement on Les Détroits du Lac Erie, which translates to the Straits of Lake Erie. That was the name of the Detroit River at the time. And they founded Forteresse Pontchartrain du Détroit, which is the Fort Pontchartrain of the Straits. As you can see here in this graphical representation of what the plan for Fort Detroit was going to be, you can see that it's laid out very much in militaristic standards. Simple grid, central axis, and east-west axis, but you also notice how closely built the buildings are, very close to one another. This is kind of very foreboding when you think about the future of Detroit over the next 100 years. Now, the fort did not incorporate civilian standards into the organization of structures or buildings. Basically, they used a military mindset, not a civilian mindset, building the structures inside the fortress. This would create a mindset that would drive development in the city for the next 100 years. As the city grew up around the fort, there was no cohesive master plan. Basically, what was driving it were wagon paths and the ribbon farms. Wherever a building was needed, it was placed, whether it was appropriate or not, whether it was close to a water source or not. That was why the ingenuity of the French ribbon farms allowed all the farmers to have access to the river. It wasn't a great plan, but it was a plan. So this brings us to the city's inherent flaw. Over the next 100 years, Detroit developed at an exponential rate that many other cities in this particular region did not experience. It went from, this particular layout, as you can see here in this wood carving image, shows that the fort was logical, but everything that began building up in the plains outside of the fort just went up wherever people wanted to put things. The lack of master planning allowed for poor arrangement of structures and very, very little regard for life safety issues, as we'd call it today. Access to municipal water sources, as well as fire protection, really didn't factor into how they built, where they built, or the materials they used to build. Now, this lack of foresight would lead to a cataclysmic event, an event of hellfire and damnation. On June 11, 1805, a fire erupted at 220 West Jefferson Avenue. It actually started in a barn owned by local banker John Harvey. Mr. Harvey was loading a wagon and hitching up some horses to go to a local store to buy some supplies. And since it was the middle of summer and it was windy, he tapped out his pipe on his boot, not wanting the smoke from the pipe to blow in his face as he was going to market. Unfortunately, the fire plug from his pipe fell out and landed in some hay. But since nothing happened right away, he didn't pay much attention to it. Well, within an hour, the fire was burning out of control, not just in his barn, but as well as several adjacent properties, which tore through the city of Detroit at a pace that no one could possibly have imagined. It was a very dry summer, very hot summer. The river was running very, very low at the time, which helped complicate matters. The survivors that didn't die in the initial blaze fled out to the wilderness, the outlying areas, as well as the river. And unfortunately, they stayed in the river so far away from shore that some were swept away by the currents and drowned. Others suffered hypothermia because the currents were running very cold at the lower parts of the river, but warmer on top. And the rub was this: you could be far enough away from the fire so you didn't get heat burns of first and second degree nature, but you also run the risk of being swept away by the current. Or you stay closer to shore and not be swept away, but run the risk of still getting burned anyway. Some survivors that were in the river claimed that it was as if God's mighty hellfire and damnation was sweeping over the city, just destroying everything in its path. The people that tried to put out the fire first used the bucket brigade system, but because the river was so low, that meant they had to go down the riverbanks to get water and then back up again. Plus, this was also complicated by the fact that there were no fire breaks, no buildings that were built in between other buildings to break a fire from consuming an entire block of buildings. The other factor was some men gave up on the bucket brigade and tried chopping buildings down with axes and battering rams. It was too late. By the time they got one building to collapse, the fire had already spread to the next building. They couldn't get in front of it fast enough to try to get it under control. The lack of emergency procedures and the access to water complicated firefighting, which they needed to try to stop this wall of fire from burning through the entire city. But by this point, it was a lost cause. By the next day, June 12th, the city literally had been erased except for 2 structures and several stone chimneys. Anybody here, by a show of hands, know what structures survived? Okay. A storage warehouse on the river and St. Anne de Detroit Church. And the reason they survived is they were the only structures that were built of stone and brick. Almost immediately after the fire, Father Gabriel Richard, the French missionary, organized the French farmers along the river to provide food, shelter, and solace to the survivors. The farmers were far enough away on their ribbon farms to avoid being destroyed by the raging inferno that was going on in the city proper. And also the fact that they had access to fresh water, some of them had wells on their properties, and they could grow food to feed the people. One of the survivors said, "Father, why has God forsaken us? What will we do?" And he uttered one simple Latin phrase which would become emblazoned on the hearts and minds of the survivors of the Great Detroit Fire. He said, "Speramus meliora resurgit tenebris," which translates from the Latin as, "We hope for better things. It will rise from the ashes." And this motto that Father Richard shared with the survivors became the official motto on the Great Seal of the city of Detroit. In this image, by the spirit of Detroit, we can see two women fleeing a representation of the Great Fire here and here, with Sporamos Meliora captured here and Resurgit Tenebris captured here. These images of the women actually represent both phrases. The one woman who looks down is hoping for better things. The woman who is looking up and forward is saying it will rise from the ashes. Now we move into the origins of Campus Martius. After the fire, Justice Augustus B. Woodward conceived of and designed a new plan for the city that can be seen here in his original plan that was perfected after the fire and approved in 1807. Now, he took inspiration from Pierre Charles L'Enfant and his plan for Washington, D.C., which itself was modeled on the plan of the city of Paris. What he came up with was the idea of using a grid of monumental avenues and streets, as well as traffic circles, to be used as nodes from which additional streets would fan out in the Baroque style and fashion to lay out the city plan. This is what Judge Woodward's master plan would have been if it had been executed per his design and specifications. You can see with the circle in the center, this is Grand Circus Park. This is Woodward Avenue with the original Campus Martius here. If his plan had come to fruition, we would have had more Grand Circus Parks located at strategic points, as well as multiple Campus Martiuses, or Martiis, I guess, would be the plural, but it would be located in this typical fashion. We would have been a European American city in Detroit. This would facilitate traffic patterns he foresaw, as well as along the city's tree-lined boulevards, parks, and main thoroughfares. It was during that City Beautiful movement of architecture that was popular at the time. In order to accomplish this task of reinventing the city, Woodward needed to pick a central reference point and primary node. Surveyors use this as a reference stake. When you see survey crews, you see the man with the transit, and you see the other person with the reference staff, holding it so they can take measurements. Well, Judge Woodward needed something more than just some individual holding a pole. He needed something massive. So when work began on the rebuild in 1806, Campus Martius became that node. But more specifically, they called it the heart of the city. And many different souvenirs from years and years afterwards would refer to Campus Martius, not specifically as Campus Martius, but more the heart of the city. As you can see in this overlay on Judge Woodward's plan, the city plan was not some Freemason conspiracy, as some people believe. You can see just by his plan, there was a central intersecting point that these streets required for reference. And this point is Campus Martius. And that actual intersection of the red lines is represented here, a survey megalith, to be the point of reference, the actual physical point of reference for survey work. This was set in an area that would become the campus. The megalith itself was actually 26 feet long of cut granite, and then when it was set in the ground, it was four-sided. 6 feet of it was buried in the ground, with the other 20 feet extending up to the sky. Now, what's very interesting about this, the megalith never moved. The megalith also was never cut. So that means once it was set in place, Detroit gradually rose up around it until it got to a point where the megalith was actually buried by the growth of the city. All streets ended up being oriented off of that column. Underneath this piece of glass located in Campus Martius Park, if you were able to remove this piece of glass and look down, you'd be looking at the survey column. So we move into the growth of Campus Martius. By 1850, Campus Martius had become what Woodward intended: a major hub of the city, a public park, a focal point of activities, a real jewel in the crown that was Detroit. But by the 19-teens, automobiles proved very good for the economy, but absolutely disastrous for Campus Martius. You can see here in a photograph taken about the turn of the century, even with the increase of trolley traffic and the widening of Woodward, the green space around the Soldiers and Sailors Monument had been cut back to just this. Very little space for pedestrians to sit and enjoy. And the large oval-shaped park that was in front of the City Hall had been cut in half. And in subsequent years, it would be cut back even further. The public park that was once located there was gradually, then completely eliminated in favor of better traffic flow. This park specifically. Most of the special features were eliminated for the sake of traffic. This park was once almost a perfect oval extending out about this far, and then gradually cut back until this was basically all that was left, and then it itself was cut even further back in later years. So the rebirth of Campus Martius, despite the creation of Hart Plaza, which was supposed to take the place of a public area in 1975, its hard concrete surfaces were just no substitute for a true